I'm Mark Schubin. Again, I'm engineer in charge of the media department at the Metropolitan Opera. So Niels said I should talk about a historic overview of technical solutions in performing arts, and I decided that's not such a good title. For one thing, it's up to you to decide whether this is historic or not me. So make it a historical overview,
sure.
But that causes a problem too, because what wasn't a technical solution in performing arts? You could do storytelling, you could do singing, you could do dancing, but not if you were storytelling around the fire. Fire is a technological solution. You can sing, but not with instrumental accompaniment, because that's a technological solution. You could dance, but not with shoes, because that's a technological solution. And going back to ancient Greek theater, they had the deus ex machina, a crane for moving people in and out. So there have been long technological solutions. Here's a book that was published in 1638, and that's a lighting dimmer diagram in the book, and there's control systems for it. The book also talks about character flying, set changing, and so on. So I've decided to make it a historical overview of media technology solutions in the performing arts, and even that has a very long history. Here, for example, is a drum. You can think of it as a drum as a musical instrument, or you can think of it as a drum as a communication system. In 1910, there was a boxing match between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries in Reno, Nevada, and there was an explorer in Central Africa, 180 miles or 300 kilometers roughly from the nearest telegraph station, and he got the results of the fight within hours of when it happened, and that was based on these drum systems. But because the drum was used for communicating at a distance, it was also interactive. One drummer would do a bum-ba-da-bum, bum-ba-dum-bum, and then a drummer at the far end would have to say ba-bum to indicate that I got the message. And then he would do it. So that's where we get some drum duets. This you may be familiar with. You've probably seen this near the hotel. It's the Danish post office symbol. And what is the symbol? As with many other post offices, it's a horn. And the reason for that was post horns were also used for communicating at a distance, and same kind of thing. Here comes the mail. Gotcha. Here is the Magician's Pyramid at Uxmal in Mexico, and this has a sound duct in it so that you could hear mysterious voices coming through. Here's another one in the United States, about the same age. This is about 2,500 years ago, and there's the diagram of where the speaking tube was so that people could communicate. So sound duct technology is something that humans have been using for thousands of years. So here's the interruption. Why are we here? Yesterday, Niels said, the Metropolitan Opera says, oh, there's no experience like being in the opera house. And he said, I'm not so sure about that. Well, why are we here? It's not for the learning. It's not for the networking. It's not for interacting, because we could do all that on lines, data lines. Why did we get jet lagged and expend the effort and cost? The good news, we get food. We get physical contact. We can do some hugging or something. We can tour around. We can earn miles. The bad news may be too much food, jet lag, effort, cost. But is that really bad? I have a question mark up there. Well, I think it's about the audience experience. And the audience experience comes, to me, the most important date in opera is 1637, the invention of the opera house. This is a poster for the very first opera that people were charged money to attend. And that's very significant. Now, what did the opera house have? It put the orchestra in front of the stage for the first time. It sold boxes to the rich, very important because that funded the opera. It had very large size, same issue. They wanted to get lots of people in so they could amortize the cost of the opera over a larger audience. By the way, we use the term in English now, melodrama, to indicate over-the-top gestures, too much emotion, something like that. That's from the original Italian word for opera, melodrama, which is from the root mello, same as melody, music, and drama, theater. So musical theater is melodrama. Now, why is it over the top? Well, if you're in a gigantic opera house, you have to do over-the-top gestures so people can see what's going on. But also, because the opera house was so large, they were concerned that they wouldn't necessarily get good sound to the far reaches, so they introduced sound ducts, the same things that the people were using in the pyramids. And of course, tickets. There's a 17th century opera ticket. I don't think it's for the first opera, but it's one in the 17th century. Well, very shortly after the opera house gets invented, along comes Athanasius Kircher, and he says, why don't we move things out of the opera house? Why don't we transmit things? So he uses those sound ducts again to get the sound of the opera house outside. That's the first plaza cast, 1673. I've talked about sound pipes. There was also sound conduction. Here's a pretty famous book, Micrographia. It's famous because of the diagrams of insects and so on that Robert Hooke saw under a microscope. But at the beginning of this book, he talks about transmitting sound by wire. And he said, I could go a very considerable distance in an instant. Now, we've been talking about latency even in an orchestra, just from one end of the orchestra to another. There's latency. That's because the speed of sound in dry room air, about 343 meters per second, but in iron, it's about 5120 meters per second, or 15 times faster. So you can transmit sound through a wire faster than you can through air. So this came into pretty famous use in the 19th century. Another physicist, Charles Wheatstone, he gave what he called Enchanted Liar concerts. He called it an aku cryptophone, or basically a mystery sound machine. And this is what the Enchanted Liar looked like, basically a big hunk of metal. And there it is, and it's suspended by a wire from the soundboard of an instrument in a room upstairs. And so the sound was conducted down the wire and emanated from the Enchanted Liar, and all the people in the audience went, ooh. But then a guy from the press came, and he saw this, and he writes it up, and he says, wow, pretty soon we're going to be able to transmit the opera all over the place using the same technology. That was 1821. Then the telegraph comes along, and what do people start using the telegraph for right away? Music. Now, all the telegraph can do is click, 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 click. But they decided to transmit music in terms of the rhythm of those clicks. So here's a report in the New York Herald in 1849. The instrument commenced drumming the notes of the tune as perfectly and distinctly as a skillful drummer could have made them at the head of a regiment. So perfectly and distinctly were the sounds of the tunes transmitted that good instrumental performers could have had no difficulty in keeping time with the instruments at this end of the wires. So there we have conduction at a distance in the middle of the 19th century. Then we go from clicks to tonal music. This is a harmonic telegraph. Note the date on that, 1874, a little before any of the first successful telephones. And here is a concert via harmonic telegraph. But then we did start transmitting music early by telephone. As early as 1876, when the first word of telephones was coming out, the New York Times said, this is going to be a big problem in the opera house, because who's going to go to the opera house anymore when you can listen to the opera at home by telephone? And sure enough, by 1877, there was an aria transmitted from Providence to Boston, an entire opera transmitted in Bellinzona, Switzerland, 1878. The first home listeners in 1880 in both New York and Plymouth, but those were courtesy listeners. The first stereo sound transmission, 1881. That's the diagram on my shirt front today. And then we start commercial service in Dundee, Scotland in 1882. Two-way with a distributed audience in 1888, geographically diverse sources in 1890, and then 1891 we get interactive music. So here's the story of that. In 1891, what happened was the operators on the telephone line would hold concerts every night. after people stopped using the telephone system. So somebody plays the banjo, somebody plays the harmonica, the others sing, one of them starts a tune, the others join in. So here is true interactive distributed performance, 1891. But I haven't spoken anything about sight at this point, so let's introduce vision, and we get the first out-of-house medium, which is the opera libretto. And some people say the first opera was in 1598, and the guy who put it on, a rich person, gave out libretti as a gift. That was so successful that he decided, oh, I should start selling these. So there's the commercial version. Notice it's not printed as well as the gift version was. And then Handel brings this into the house by performing an opera in Italian in London, where the people don't speak Italian. So he provides a libretto with a translation, but it's too dark in the opera house to read the libretto. So he sells candles. And he makes money on the candles. Other vision at a distance, there is a telegraph-controlled puppet in 1851. Some people say the Canadian National Opera started the idea of titles in the house in 1983. Here is a UK patent in 1881 for titles in the house, lit by a gas jet. Moving image projection. Here is a book that was published in 1728, and this is at the Hamburg Opera. This is a diagram of a performance of Giulio Cesare on the stage, and we have this backdrop of the skyline of London that was projected, and then we have these fireworks in front of it that was motion projected in 1726 in Hamburg. There's a diagram or a picture of the projector on the left, and the thing that's sparkling back and forth is an indication of how the motion slide worked. There's a little crank on the side, and you could crank glass plates to indicate what was going on. Today, of course, we have projection that's live and computer graphic images, high resolution. There are sensors that are visual. We get situations like this. This is a production of Damnation of Faust at the Metropolitan Opera in 2008. And here you see a gondola being rowed across the stage, and you can see the ripples in the water as it moves, except there's no water. The gondola is moving. There's an infrared camera that's picking up the motion of the gondola. That's sending it to a computer that's creating the computer graphics, and it's providing the ripples as the thing moves across. This is motion capture in Avatar in 2009, so that that actress, Zoe Saldana, can become an avatar, or she's actually a real Na'vi. But here is an opera. This is called Death and the Powers by Todd Mackover, who heads the Opera of the Future group at MIT. And the basic theme of the opera is there's this rich guy, he wants to be immortal, so he downloads himself into his house's appliances. And after he's done this, he wants to let his family know that he's still around, so here is a chandelier romancing his wife. Now, how did they do that? Well, they have a tenor, and the tenor is singing, or actually he was a baritone, James Maddalena, and they had what they called emotion capture. So there were cameras looking at the tenor, picking up his voice on microphone, and causing the chandelier and other devices, robots on stage, to move according to the emotions. Well, if you're doing that, does the tenor have to be in the opera house? No. It could be anywhere, except for the latency issue. Here's the proposal for what Niels was so excited about, transmission of opera around the world. This was proposed in 1877. Here's the article in the New York Sun talking about both the telephone and electroscope applied on a large scale would render it possible to represent at one time on 100 stages in various parts of the world the opera or play sung or acted in any given theater. Took a little while to implement, but we're talking about conducting by television yesterday. Here's an article in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, September 4th, 1928. Fritz Reiner is going to use television to conduct an offstage orchestra in Mahler work. Now, he was doing Mahler's Second Symphony, which has an offstage musicians, and according to Reiner, these are Mahler's instructions in the score. The sound of this orchestra must reach the listener only like a faint, almost inaudible breath of music, carried to his ears only occasionally by the gentle sigh of the wind. Well, tradition is you put the musicians off stage, and they watch the conductor through a hole in the door or something like that. But he decided that wasn't far enough. So he wanted to put them in a completely different room, send a picture of himself via television to them, send the sound of the orchestra via television, and then the sound of the offstage orchestra would be conducted only faintly through the walls to get into the concert hall. He didn't achieve it, which was actually maybe a good thing, because here is a solution to a technical problem that someone came up with in 1932. Television in 1928 was very insensitive. So there's a television camera, and these big round things around here that look like lights, they're actually the sensors. They are photocells. And this thing in here that looks like maybe the lens of the camera, that's actually generating a beam of light that's scanning. So the only light in the room is what's coming out of the television camera, sort of like the old Greek idea that we see by rays coming out of our eyes. Well, that means it's dark in the studio. So how do people read the music? No problem. We'll print it in radium on black paper. Nevertheless, in 1928, a play was televised for the first time in Schenectady, New York, and it was seen as far away as California. That's what this story is over here. Live cinema transmissions of opera first implemented in 1952. Metropolitan Opera. They went to 31 cinemas in 27 cities. It was low definition black and white. It was worse than the worst radio sound. About a $60 top for the ticket, and it was rated very highly. And I'll get into that issue of why it was rated very highly in a moment. Non-live media technology, also pretty old. What you're seeing being wound up now is something that was built in 1784 as a present for Queen Marie Antoinette. And it would play 8 tunes from a different Handel operas. That can go on for a while. There was a 1730, by the way, the reason that we still have that today is Marie Antoinette was freaked out by the fact that it looked too much like her, so she gave it to the Academy of Sciences. If she had owned it, it would have been destroyed. In 1738, we have a clock over here that played organ pieces, again from operas. Here's another clock from 1625 that had both an organ and a spinet, would play music. Not sure if it was opera or not. And here is a musical device from around 1480, still working today. It's in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and you can go look at it there. It is programmable. So you can change the music that it plays, and this is way, way, way centuries before the Jacquard loom. You can find indications of mechanical musical instruments automatically programmed back to the 9th century in Baghdad. So the last stuff that I showed you was for rich people. What did poor people do? Well, they had discs. Before the first gramophone disc, there were music box discs, and they were opera tunes also. And these would be available very inexpensively, even back in the 19th century. And before that, they had organ grinders. And how soon did the music get out to the organ grinders? Here's an 1845 story in the New York Mirror. There's a new opera that came out that year, The Bohemian Girl, and the tunes were already established favorites, ground by every hand organ. Here's the advancement of recording media technology. For sound recording, everyone talks about Edison's first phonograph, or maybe other people around the same time, but 2 decades before that, there was the phonautograph.
The thing about the phonautograph was it recorded sound. It was never intended to play back. It was intended only to allow you to analyze the sound. But in 2009 at Lawrence Laboratory, they decided that they could play it back, and so they used lasers and a bunch of high technology, and we now can hear opera arias recorded in 1860. And here is Thomas Edison's first patent application for, or actually a patent caveat, it's before the application, for motion pictures. And what is the purpose of motion pictures? To present a continuous opera. It's the only purpose he had. But long before Edison, the head of special effects at the Paris Opera was issued the first photographic motion picture patent in 1852, and it happened to be 3D. But both of those lost some form of stimulation. So the sound recordings had no visual stimulation, and the early silent movies had no oral stimulation. So what did you do to restore it? Well, in the case of the sound recordings, various articles would say what you need to do is build yourself a little puppet theater so you have something to look at. So here's one that was built in 1926 and toured around the world. And then as for the silent movies, notice at the bottom here there's a little score, and it's backwards, and it has an arrow. This is one of the technologies that was used so you could have musicians behind the screen. That's why the score is backwards, so it looks frontwards when they see it from behind the screen, and they can follow along and see from the arrow where they are in the score and know how to play. There were also systems that would have a little image of the conductor down at the bottom so the musicians in the cinema would know what to do. In 1927, the first opera score was written that had a film interlude built into the opera score. And then in 1928, the first opera with a recording in the score, literally, there was a sound recording that was shipped out with the score so that you could play it when you were doing the opera. So here's the arc of commercial opera audience experience, and to me, that's what's important. So 1882, we have first commercial opera over the telephone. We lost the visual aspect of it, and we also lost community. People would listen at home in their beds. 1889, we have sound recording. That adds the loss of duration. You could only record 2 or 3 minutes. And it lost the event nature. You were listening whenever you wanted to listen, not when the opera was happening. Silent movies come out, we lose even the sound, although the visual was restored. When sound movies come, we have the sound restored. 1910, we have radio, and we've lost the cost. Now, is that significant? Isn't it better not to have to pay? Well, it turns out there's a psychological principle called cognitive dissonance. It's when two things battle against one another. So if you pay $100 or 600 krona for an opera ticket, and you don't like the opera, then you must have been stupid to spend all that money. But you don't want to be stupid. So maybe the opera wasn't as bad as you thought. So the idea of cost actually can help people like things. So the idea that people went to a cinema in 1952 and spent as much as the equivalent of $60 in 1952 to see an opera in the cinema, that's why probably so many people said it was good, even though it was black and white, rotten sound, and so on. 1934, we have opera on television. 1952, the live cinema. So we restore both the community. You're going to a location. You have other people doing the same thing. And the cost. It's an event. In 2006, what Niels was talking about, we restore the quality by going to high definition. By the way, what you saw last night was just something I happen to have on my computer. So the quality is considerably better than what you had then. But we still have a problem. In what you saw, there was a television director, and the television director was showing you what the director wanted you to see, not necessarily what you wanted to see. Maybe you wanted to look at the chorus at that moment. Maybe you wanted to look at the orchestra. So we don't yet have the opera house experience. What do we need? Do we need 3D? Do we need 4K, 8K, something like that? Don't know, but we would like to have an experience without the video director. Something that allows you to do what you would do in an opera house. So now let's get into interactivity. The embracing of the latency, as we heard yesterday, these are some images from the Satellite Arts Project in 1977. A geostationary satellite has a latency built in of a quarter second just going up and down to the satellite. But they used that for performing. One performer could perform with herself, or two performers could get together. This was a sound concert, people playing together long after that telephone concert in 1891, but this is using digital technology between the UK, Seattle, and New York, everyone playing together. We have collaborative composition occurring starting in 1995, Spazio. And then for the Olympics in 1998, somebody had a thought and said, gee, you know, we have 5 Olympic rings and they represent 5 continents. Why can't we have people on 5 continents all singing together in Beethoven's Ode to Joy? So they said, okay, let's do this for the opening of the Nagano Winter Olympics. But then they started figuring out the latency issues. And so what they did was they put the orchestra in a concert hall, and all they did was play. They had nothing coming back to them. They fed choruses in Beijing, Berlin, Cape Town, Nagano, and New York, and Sydney. There were multi-hop satellite delays of more than 2 seconds. And then all of that came to the Olympic Stadium, and just the Olympic Stadium had such long distances that there were delays as high as a quarter of a second, roughly, just for the speakers. And then everyone in the stadium sang together, and wasn't this wonderful, choruses on 5 continents singing together? Well, yes, but the only place you heard everyone singing together was at your ears in the stadium. No one else heard everything. And then we have Niels's World Opera Project, which, by the way, just from the standpoint of a regular opera house, is fantastic. Metropolitan Opera schedules operas many years in advance because that's the only way to get everyone to adjust their schedules. Can this singer be here at this time? Can that singer be there at that time? Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't have to do that? And if the singer happens to be in Sydney, then he or she can perform with the orchestra in London, and so on and so forth. But there is that latency issue. And yesterday you saw one presentation that said, oh, we're talking about a latency of 10 milliseconds plus the propagation delay, whatever that happens to be. Well, here's propagation delay, New York to Sydney, at the speed of light, at a direct path. So if there were a way somehow to get the light exactly from the Sydney Opera House to Metropolitan Opera House, nonstop, no bends or anything like that. And if it went through something other than fiber optics, because fiber optics slows down the light considerably, that would still be 53 milliseconds of propagation delay in one direction, and another 53 milliseconds coming back, and then another delay going to another singer, and another delay going to another singer. So the delays can be significant. So I'm happy to report that last year, for the first time, there was neutrino communication. The ability to actually send useful information over a beam of neutrinos. What's nice about neutrinos is they travel at about the speed of light and they pass through anything. So you don't have to go along the surface of the Earth. You can tunnel directly from Sydney to New York or London or something like that, and it makes the path considerably smaller. Unfortunately, extremely low data rates at the moment. The word neutrino was what they transmitted, and it took 6 minutes to transmit that word. So thank you very much.